Braam Klopper is the pastor of the Kempton Park East congregation of the Dutch Reformed Church and has served there for the past 36 years. He is also a pastoral therapist specializing in grief and bereavement. He is the author of 2 publications on bereavement and the narrator of a series of CDs on grief called Conversations on Grief. Furthermore, he is often invited as a guest on a variety of radio programs and is a specialized witness to the Supreme Court on topics such as the rights of parents after the loss of unborn children. On a weekly basis, he hosts a program on Radio Pulpit called Searching the Scriptures, or Verstaan jy wat jy lees, which he usually does with Theo Groeneveld and Jackie Barker. He presents seminars to equip pastors, medical doctors, and other medical professionals, as well as lay members in churches. Most important of all, he is a grandfather of 2 very special grandchildren. We welcome Braam to our conference and are so grateful for his input.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the privilege of sharing with you on this very, very important topic. The topic today, the impact of COVID on bereavement. I'm sure there's been a bit of a misunderstanding with the communication, because when I was invited, I said I needed 4.5 hours to talk on this topic. And then someone misunderstood and allocated 45 minutes. But I'll try my utmost, and I'll try to touch on a few very important and practical aspects of the impact of COVID on bereavement. I'll be treating 2 main topics. The first is that I'd like to touch onto a few aspects of bereavement not limited to COVID. And then in the second place, to have a look at a few very practical aspects specifically about COVID and the impact on the process of bereavement. So let's start off with the first one. 2 aspects that is not limited to COVID, but is very, very important to understand the bereaved better, especially in these times. The first I'd like to call the confusion between salvation and loss. As pastors, we usually focus on salvation, and that's absolutely understandable. We argue that the loved one who has died is now with God. They have a new life, they're in a new dimension. And we say things like they wouldn't even for a moment consider trading places with us. We also see death as the end of all forms of suffering, of illness, of the difficulties of aging, etc. And sometimes we get so carried away that we begin to be excited in our explaining of this life after death and this relief that the loved one would experience. And then we start off coloring death in the beautiful colors of the rainbow, but not always realizing that salvation cannot cancel or eliminate loss. These 2 aspects are true at exactly the same time. Salvation, yes, but loss as well. Loss is as real as salvation. And the loss people suffer need to be mourned. We need to acknowledge their loss. We need to acknowledge their need for mourning. We should actually beware of causing feelings of guilt in people. Very often the way we talk about salvation has the effect on people that they feel guilty about their sadness, about their intense emotions, about their loss, creating a sort of a feeling that if your faith was only stronger, you would not be as sad as you are, and you have so much to be grateful for. And just think of the wonderful fact that your loved one is with God and safe. I think one of the scriptures that has bearing on this aspect we find in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. And different translations is very important in this regard. Paul does not say that we as believers do not grieve. What he actually says is that we do grieve, but obviously we do not grieve in the same way, in the same manner as those who have no hope. Acknowledge the loss that the bereaved suffer and encourage them to mourn their losses. Then there's a second aspect. The effect of this aspect is very often underestimated on the bereaved. If someone would ask me, what is the single most important aspect about bereavement that we need to take into account, it would be the following. Most people suffer with feelings and thoughts of helplessness, and this is extremely important. Let's just take into account the following as background. We live in a society and a community in a time in which so many things can either be repaired or replaced. Think of your own examples, medical examples, insurance, etc., etc., etc. It's something we just naturally do. First of all, we try to repair, to fix. And then when something can really not be repaired, fixed, we go to the alternative, and that is replacing. So this becomes a way of life. There are many exceptions, but I think that death, the death of a loved one, is the most important exception. Because when someone we love passes away, there is no way that any of us can fix or repair death or the loss. And obviously, the person who died can in no way be replaced. We often create totally the opposite impression with our children when their pets die, which is an ideal opportunity to teach them about death and loss and the permanence of death. But we often fall into the trap of replacing the pet, often even with the same type of pet. We get another fox terrier with a black spot on the right eye, and we call him Spotty the second or Spotty the third. Eventually, we're at Spotty the eighth, and the children hasn't realized that they need to mourn their loss and they cannot replace. Now, what is the impact of this impossibility of replacing or repairing in the face of death? This realization leaves the bereaved helpless and powerless. But there's more to it than that. We need to realize that this feeling of helplessness and powerlessness very often transmutes into anger. Sometimes it's a very misdirected anger, being angry at life, at everything, at small things, even being angry at God. This anger is an expression of the feelings of helplessness, powerlessness, and we need to see them for what they are. It also transmutes into intense emotional reactions. This is one of the most important aspects of death and bereavement that we need to take into account. This brings us to our second main section, some aspects of the impact of COVID on the process of bereavement. Let me start off with, firstly, probably the most common aspect people are battling with: feelings of guilt. More specifically, people feeling guilty about the fact that they could not be with their loved ones when they were admitted to hospital. Or because of the regulations of COVID and the lockdowns, etc., people could not travel, often from a different country or a different province, to be with their loved ones. These feelings of guilt are very, very real, and we need to take them into account. People feel very, very guilty if they could not be there during that period of illness, not be able to hold a hand of the loved one in hospital. And even more important, people feel guilty that they were not present at that moment of passing away, a very, very special and important moment when someone dies. How can we help the bereaved who suffer, who battle with these feelings of guilt? We need to take into account that these feelings of guilt, although very real, are not very realistic. How can we help those members that we encounter who suffer these feelings of guilt? I would like to give 3 points of advice. Talk to these people. Tell them to take into account that they need to be realistic about exactly what the situation was. It was not your choice not to be at the bedside of your loved one. It was not your choice not to travel and be with them. These were rules. These were restrictions. These were part of a very real and a very difficult situation. Help them acknowledge to themselves, this was not your choice. This was not in your hands. This was not within your control. And therefore, you can let go of the feelings of guilt. Secondly, encourage people to take comfort from Scripture. I'd like to refer to 2 scriptures, one in the Old and one in the New Testament. The first, Psalm 139, especially verses 4 to 12. Read that again. Realize that God was there, although you were not there. God did never forsake your loved one. Read that wonderful psalm of His presence everywhere and under all circumstances, and take comfort from that. Then the New Testament, the well-known scripture, Romans chapter 8, especially verses 38 to 39. Nothing in this whole creation, not even life or death, can separate us from the love of God that there is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Thirdly, you can encourage people to write letters to the loved one who has passed away, writing to them and explaining to them the frustration that they feel, the false feelings of guilt that they encounter, explaining to the beloved one exactly what the situation was, what I would have loved to have done, how I would have wanted to be there for you and be there to hold your hand at that moment of transition. These letters, one or a series of letters, can be extremely therapeutic to those who write them. Then a second aspect, especially around the situation during COVID and the impact thereof. I call this be aware and beware of what I call the reverse argument. Let me explain. I'm going to talk you through 2 different scenarios or 2 different situations that many people have encountered. The first is, many people feared being admitted to hospital after they've been diagnosed positive with or tested positive with COVID. Many people said to their family members, if you take me to hospital, I will die. You won't see me again. And families often respected these strong convictions. And if someone is ill, it's very difficult to argue with them. Also the fear of upsetting them further. And then they respected these feelings, but then by not taking them, these people became more and more ill. And then either they never took them to hospital, or they did take them to hospital at a very late and critical stage in the illness. In cases where these loved ones died, people very often use the argument within themselves to say that if only I had insisted on taking him to hospital, if only I had insisted to have him admitted, then the loved one might have survived, putting the blame on themselves for not reacting faster or different to the wishes of the loved one. But let's also take a look at the opposite situation or scenario and the reverse argument. Some people rushed their loved ones to hospital, believing it might give them the best chance. It might ensure their survival, their recovery. In such cases where people died, and that also happened too often, what would the argument be? I often hear that people use the reverse argument. They then say that maybe if I didn't take him to hospital, maybe if we only kept him at home, if we treated him here, then he might have recovered. He might have survived. Can you see using the reverse argument when the choice we made did not result in the recovery or survival of the loved one? We need to help people to realize that either way, they had no guarantees. Either way, they had no way of knowing ahead what the end result would be. And they have no guarantee that if they did differently, that the loved one would have survived. The only advice that I think we can give people struggling through this is that they should find comfort in their motive. They need to ask themselves, what was my motive for not taking him to hospital? Or, what was my motive for insisting that he go to hospital? This is very, very important, because you need to realize that your motive was that you wanted the best for your loved one. You wanted to give him the best chance of recovering and surviving. Your motive was the driving force behind your decision. So if you have peace about your motive, that will help you. Also remember, you took the decision with a light at your disposal at that moment. There's a wonderful and very true saying: hindsight is the only exact science. But when you were in the situation and you had to make the decision, you did not have the advantage of hindsight. I hope that this will comfort many people. Stop blaming yourself for the outcome. Let's for a moment think about a third aspect. The aspect of not being able to attend or participate in things like a wake or a funeral or a memorial service. This is even of more importance for those within the African tradition, who go to great lengths when it comes to attending memorial services, funerals, and wakes. We need to ask, if this was a situation and people couldn't attend, couldn't participate, how does this missing out on these events impact the process of bereavement? Well, to answer that, we need for a moment to look at what I would like to call the first grief tasks. In my approach to bereavement, I do not work with the old model of grief phases, I work with a very active model of 5 grief tasks that need to be worked through. In this presentation, we don't have time to look at all 5 the grief tasks, but let's have a look at the first one for a moment. The first grief task is that the reality that the loved one has died needs to settle in. It needs to set in, and that is the opposite of denial. This first grief task, the realization, the settling in of the reality of death, is usually accomplished by events such as, if at all possible, spending time with the body of the loved one after their death, saying your goodbyes, touching that body, realizing that death has really taken place. Then at a memorial service or a funeral, just to be able to see that coffin, even if it's a closed coffin, it helps with the realization this really happened. Attending the funeral or the memorial service has a great impact on people, bringing this realization home. But even more, at these events, there's a sharing in the emotions of others. That is actually the second grief task, that the emotions accompanying death and loss need to be expressed and not suppressed. These events gives a natural opportunity for these emotions to be expressed, to be vented. Many people during COVID did not have the opportunity of attending these events, of sharing in these events. That leaves them with feelings and thoughts such as death and the realization thereof takes much longer to become a reality. There's often a feeling of waiting for the person to return, hoping that they would return, thinking that it's as if they've just gone away for a while and they will come back to us. This is heartbreaking. Then a feeling of frustration. People are frustrated by the fact that they did not have the opportunity to say their goodbyes. Very often to say goodbyes in those days or hours or minutes before physical death taking place, or also saying their goodbyes, being present at the body of a loved one or at the service or the memorial. I do realize that many people had a wonderful privilege of still sharing in these events, although not being physically present, but by use of the social media, Zoom, Teams, live streaming. That was a great privilege, but it was still a second prize. But even more important is that although many people had that privilege, many more people did not have the privilege or the means to share in those events via the social media. And that makes it extremely difficult for them. This aspect has a powerful impact on the process of bereavement. I'd like to touch on a fourth separate aspect. Many people did not have the opportunity of attending what is called an after tears party. For long periods, these after tears parties were not allowed. At other times when they were allowed, people might not have been able to be physically present. Please allow me just to say something about this term, an after tears party. What a terrible term to use. In the first place, it's not a party. In the second place, it's not after our tears, it's amidst our tears. These events are events of commemoration. It's an opportunity of sharing our memories about the loved one. That is the most important aspect of being together after such a service, eating something, drinking something, sharing our memories, saying how much I cared for him, how much he meant to me, what a difference he made in my life, what I remember best about him. Precious, precious things to share. It is also an event of sharing and celebrating someone's life. It's also an important gathering of our support system. It's wonderful to be there with our friends, with our family members, with people of our community and very often of our congregation that share in our loss. They're there to comfort us. They're there to support us. They're there to love us. It's an opportunity for caring, loving, to embrace, and to encourage. Lastly, it's sharing in a shared loss. So important to know that other people also experience the loss of my husband or my child as a loss in their lives. In the face of people missing out on these events, we'll have to be creative. We'll have to find alternative ways to show our caring, to show our loving, to show our support, and to bring comfort as far as possible. In closing, I'd like to mention a few aspects that I think we, especially as pastors, need to be aware of and take into account. I think in the first place, we need a better understanding of the process of bereavement. Grief and bereavement is not a technique that can be mastered. There's no such thing as a dummy's guide to feel better. No such thing as 10 easy steps to stop mourning or to stop longing for the loved one. It's a process that people need to live through. We can support them, we can help them, but we need a better understanding. Then, we need to take a step back and be prepared to listen. As pastors, we have a lot of things to say. We have the ability of saying wonderful things and bringing comfort. But very often, we do some damage by talking too easily, by talking too much, by not listening. If you listen to someone who is bereaved, someone who's in the process of grieving, you will do them a wonderful, wonderful service. What do we listen for? Well, we need to let people talk about their feelings. And often by not reacting, we sort of give them license for their grief. This is probably one of the most important things to listen for in the first place. How do you feel? And then just listen. Sometimes people will also express their feelings of guilt. Wonderful if they find that they can share this with you. And then again, we need to listen. Then we can try and put these feelings of guilt into perspective, but most importantly, again, give them the opportunity to express this. Very difficult when they express their feelings of anger and their thoughts of anger, especially when it's directed at God. We feel to intervene. We feel to protect God and argue on his behalf. God will understand. We need to listen. Try to listen to how they experience their loss, to how great this loss is to them. And then try to validate, to acknowledge that something terrible has happened, that you suffered an enormous loss, and that actually there are no words that can comfort you. That validation of someone's loss would mean so much to them. Of course, the opposite of validation is to treat people with comments like, well, at least he was 85 years old. The old saying, he had a good innings. Please refrain from all of these platitudes. Platitudes are those things that we grew up with, things we've heard other people say in the face of death, but never really thought about the implications of those platitudes, and whether they really bring comfort to people. Part of our platitudes are to try and minimize people's loss. I use one example. A woman lost her son. Someone tried to comfort her by saying, at least you have 3 other children. I know a friend who suffered the loss of her only son. That is minimizing, saying or implicating that you only had a 25% loss and the other woman had a 100% loss. Not true. Beware of minimizing. Beware of rationalizing. And also, especially we as pastors, beware of theologizing. Beware of stating that every death was just the will of God. Many things in this world and in this life happens against the will of God. We need to take that into account. Beware of creating a caricature of God, of this one who picks the prettiest flowers, the one who needs people. By saying that, we are drawing a caricature of God and implicating God as the cause of death. People find that not comforting, but extremely, extremely difficult. There is one more aspect that we can listen to and encourage people to talk about, and that is about the loved one. Just ask them the simple question, tell me about your father. Who was he in this life? What are the main things that you will remember about him? What is the impact that he had on your life? People love to talk about their loved ones in most cases. And you will again do them a great service by listening and realizing how special this loved one was. Also helping you to understand the immense loss that they suffer. Then lastly, I don't need to remind you, but we need to remind the bereaved that the only real comfort is that Jesus Christ has conquered death. He is the resurrected one. He is the one who said, John 11 verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even if he dies. That is the greatest and only real comfort. But then again, remember that that comfort does not eliminate the loss, and the loss needs to be mourned. May God bless you and help you during your encouragement, your comfort with the bereaved. Thank you. I've been asked just to introduce you to the books and the CDs that I have available for help. Very often people can't get to you for grief counseling. In many instances, men especially don't want to talk to someone, being afraid of their emotions, etc. So I've created a series of CDs to help in such instances. The first is called Conversations on Grief, Practical Advice for People Who Are Mourning. They are all also electronically available. This is a CD that touches onto all the difficult subjects that most people battle with during their process of grief or bereavement. This first one is suitable for any loss. The second one is more specialized, Conversations on Grief After the Death of a Child, because the process of grief and bereavement after the loss of a child is totally different from that from other losses. And there's practical advice as how to deal with these things, and they're based on experience over a period of more than 30 years with couples who have suffered the loss of children. Then in Afrikaans, there's another two available, not yet translated into English. The one is Conversations on Grief After Suicide, but I repeat, in Afrikaans. And then there's another one in Afrikaans, Conversations on Grief After Stillbirth or Miscarriage. The price of these CDs at present is 250 Rand, and I repeat, they can be ordered electronically and be sent to you on in an email format. Then there are two books, both in Afrikaans, but I know many of you do understand Afrikaans or have family members or friends that you'd like to reach out to who are Afrikaans. The first one is in Afrikaans called Wanneer Woorde Ontbreek. Directly translated, it would be something like For a Lack of Words, or When I Realize I Won't Know What to Say. The book is written for two target groups, those who are bereaved, but also for those who want to comfort and help them, pastors, doctors, lay members of the congregation, etc., etc. The book basically treats the 5 grief tasks. In my talk, I mentioned that I don't work with the old concept of grief phases, but with a much more modern concept that of 5 grief tasks that need to be worked through during the process of bereavement. The last book is in Afrikaans leeg, just empty, directly translated. This book is on pregnancy loss, whether it's stillbirth or miscarriage or other pregnancy losses. The book has been written by 3 authors, Dr. Malena de Tooy, a gynecologist, who gives all the important medical information on pregnancy losses in the first section of the book. Then my section covers the process of bereavement in these cases, as well as the theological questions that couples battle with after the loss of an unborn baby. The third section is by a female pastor, and her name's Justine Pike, and she shares her personal journey after her miscarriage. There is also true stories of 4 other women included in the book. The price of these books are 180 Rand. They can also be ordered directly from me. I hope that this information will be of some help to you. You can also contact me on my email address. That is info at, small letters, Braam, Klopper, B-R-A-M, Klopper, K-L-O-P-P-E-R.co.za. Thank you and God bless.